Most people picture early medieval Ireland as a quiet island of mist, monasteries, and prayer too poor to tempt and too holy to violate. That illusion dies the moment the first Viking ships cut through the grey water. They did not come to admire saints or study sacred books. They came for silver, cattle, slaves, and the discovery that this island, like every other, could be made to bleed. And the deeper shock is this: Ireland was not peacefully waiting to be invaded. It was already at war with itself. So when the Norse raids began in 795, they did not descend on a sleeping paradise. They entered a fractured landscape of rival kingships, blood feuds, church wealth, and armed local pride. That made Ireland harder to conquer, but easier to ravage. One king might resist, another might bargain, another might quietly enjoy seeing a neighbor burn. The raids kept coming anyway, season after season, until terror became routine. Churches were stripped, shrines smashed, and communities with no armor at all were forced to face men who had crossed the sea for profit. But raiding was only the beginning. The real transformation came when the Vikings stayed, fortified harbors, and turned the Irish coast into part of a violent network across the North Atlantic. They built long forts, temporary ship forts along rivers, then strengthened them into permanent bases. These places were not just camps, they were engines. Ships could strike inland, retreat to safety, and return with captives and loot. That is how a raid becomes a system. Dublin became the most dangerous example. What began as a shoreline foothold grew into a fortified port, linked by trade routes, slave markets, and a steady flow of silver. Once that happened, Ireland was no longer resisting passing storms. It was fighting an enemy that had planted roots in its own soil and could be supplied from beyond the horizon. And this is where the story becomes more brutal than the legend. The Vikings did not collide with a peaceful island of harmless monks. They crashed into another warrior society, one already fluent in violence. Irish life was built around kinship, land, cattle, and honor, but also sudden retaliation. So the Norse never faced one united enemy. They faced dozens of enemies, some resisting, some bargaining, some preparing to betray the moment profit changed sides. That is why the Viking Age in Ireland was never a clean war of natives against foreigners. It became a shifting contest of tribute, marriage, revenge, faith, and survival. Some Norse leaders married into Irish noble families. Some accepted Christianity. Some ruled like outsiders by morning and bargained like Irish kings by dusk. Every alliance solved one problem and created another. Dublin was seized, lost, and seized again. And when the Vikings were driven out in 902, that did not end the story. Their return only brought a fiercer wave of raiding, enslavement, and pressure on the kingdoms around them. Women were taken. Children vanished. Families were ripped apart and sold across the sea. From Munster came the man later turned into legend, Brian Boru. He was forged in a world where power moved through spears, alliances, and murder. And he grew up with hunger. War carved that hunger into him. Vikings and Irish rivals killed his father, killed brothers, and shattered whatever safety his bloodline might have offered. His older brother Mathgaman rose first, made terms when necessary, and tried to hold Munster together in a world that rewarded compromise one year and punished it the next. Brian learned a harsher lesson. To him, caution could look too much like surrender. So while other rulers negotiated, he built his reputation in the rough margins of war, sleeping on wet ground, striking fast, and learning the island one ambush at a time. In 967, Mathgaman and Brian led Munster forces against Viking enemies in a major clash and broke them in the field. The fugitives were chased to Limerick, and the victory made Brian impossible to ignore. But no one in this age fought clean. Towns were ravaged, prisoners were sorted, fighters were killed, and those fit for sale were enslaved in return. That is the part polished legends prefer to hide. Brian rose in a world of brutality by mastering brutality, not by standing above it. Then, in 976, Mathgaman was captured by rivals and killed. and Brian's private fury became public war. Now he moved with terrifying speed. He struck the enemies who had destroyed his family, killed the Viking ruler of Limerick and his sons, and forced Munster into obedience through relentless momentum. At that point, he was no longer merely surviving. He was expanding, and expansion drew the attention of the most dangerous obstacle in Ireland, Niall Secnail, the High King, a ruler who had already bent Dublin before and had no intention of watching Munster's rising warlord overtake him. The struggle that followed reveals the central truth of the age. Brian had spent years fighting Vikings. Now an Irish king stood between him and the island. Niall Secnail raided Brian's territory and even uprooted Brian's sacred tree, an act that was not just strategic but humiliating. Brian answered with years of war, tightening his grip on neighboring lands, and with perfect historical irony, using subject Viking fleets to carry his armies against Irish rivals. It was his real method: pressure, leverage, and ports. He did not just win battles. He cut supply lines, punished enemies, rewarded allies, and used coastal power to appear where resistance least expected him. Yesterday's invader could become today's transport network ally or paid sword. After more than a decade of pressure, the two kings reached a settlement in 997, dividing the island between them. It looked stable. It was nothing of the kind, because peace at the top invites rebellion below. In Dublin, Sigtrygg's Silkbeard saw an opening. In Leinster, old resentments stirred. Brian answered fast. In 999, he and Niall Secnail marched on Dublin, and the armies met at Glenmama. The fighting was savage. Brian won, and he burned and plundered the city to make fear outrun rumor. But even here, Brian showed the cold flexibility that separated him from simpler warlords. He did not erase Dublin's leadership. He restored Sigtrygg after submission, because usefulness mattered more than total destruction. By then, many of Ireland's so-called foreigners were no longer simple outsiders. They were Norse-Irish, bound to the island by trade, language, marriage, and ambition. Through family alliances and political pressure, he brought the major Viking ports under his influence. And harbors meant more than coastline. They meant silver, ships, intelligence, and hardened fighters. In other words, they meant reach. So he turned again toward the High Kingship. Niall Secnail resisted, but the balance had shifted. Brian had built something broader than regional power, a machine of loyalty, coercion, church support, and maritime strength. In time, the old High King yielded. That was the moment Brian Boru became High King of Ireland, not because the island suddenly became united in spirit, but because one man had outmaneuvered, outlasted, and overpowered every serious rival. He traveled widely, collecting submissions, rewarding allies, and seeking legitimacy from the church. In Ireland, swords could seize power, but ritual made power look rightful, and appearance mattered almost as much as force. For a moment, stability seemed possible. Then in 1013, Dublin and Leinster rebelled again, and the containment shattered. This time, the danger was sharper. Niall Secnail supported Brian, but the campaign went badly enough to prove the rebels had real teeth. Sigtrygg knew local defiance might not be enough, so he reached across the sea for help. Warriors came from the Orkneys, the Isle of Man, and the wider Norse world. That changed the scale of the threat. Dublin was no longer just rebelling. It was calling in veteran strength from beyond Ireland to decide whether Norse power would remain subordinate or rise again on its own terms. By 1014, Brian was old, somewhere in his 70s, perhaps older, but age did not release him. One last campaign had become unavoidable. He gathered a large army from well beyond Munster, proof that his authority still carried weight across the Gaelic world, even as rebellion tightened around Dublin. Through the spring, his forces devastated hostile territory on the march east, weakening the enemy before the main battle could begin. If Dublin and its overseas allies won, years of Brian's work could begin to unravel in a single season. On Good Friday, the armies faced each other near Clontarf. Brian did not charge at the front. Command fell mainly to his sons and captains, while the old king remained behind the lines. Then the armies crashed together, and the battle turned into repetitive medieval labor where survival shrank to inches. At first it was raw collision shields, axes, spears, and the heavy breath of horses. Lines held, then buckled, then reformed. The Norse allies fought hard, and Leinster pressed their advantage when they could. But Brian's side kept grinding forward, and the longer the battle lasted, the more the weight of numbers and coordination began to matter. At the center of that storm, Brian's son Murchad fought with the fury of a man carrying his father's crown inside his chest. He became one of the battle's driving forces, and then one of its great losses. Murchad was killed. So was Brian's grandson. Victory was approaching, but it was wrapped in personal ruin. As the enemy line began to crack, a second danger appeared: escape. Men rushed back toward their ships. But the coastline does not care about courage. The tide shifted. Water rose. Paths that had been open became traps of mud, surf, and panic. Some were cut down with their backs turned. Others drowned. Warriors who had crossed the sea to shape Ireland's future were swallowed by Irish water instead. It should have ended there, but history rarely allows clean endings. Near victory, a band of Vikings reached Brian's position, and the old king became the final target in the war he had spent a lifetime defining. The exact details blur into saga, but the core remains hard and clear. Brian Boru died on the day his forces broke the coalition against him. It was not remembered simply as triumph. It was remembered as triumph paid for in blood too intimate to celebrate without grief. The king was dead, his heir was dead, and yet the enemy had still failed. Clontarf did not unify Ireland, and it did not erase the Vikings overnight. Dublin survived. Trade survived. Norse settlements remained for generations. Their power was bent, contained, and slowly absorbed over time. And that is the final irony. Ireland did not win by becoming one nation under one banner. It survived by enduring, by adapting, by resisting long enough for its enemies to be changed by the very land they tried to own. And if you enjoyed this story, like this video, subscribe for more battles that changed history, and comment below which city or country you're watching from.